Hi, Dr. Newman here. Welcome back to English 340, Survey of English Literature 1. We're going to get a little bit into course content now. This first video will give you a kind of trailer or overview of everything that we're going to be studying over the next 16 weeks. And it is a lot. We are covering literature from over 1,000 years. I think of this as being kind of like these survey courses. It's like kind of a bus stop tour of European museums. It's like, okay, you get off the bus, let's go into the Louvre. You've got 2 hours, and then you got to get back on the bus. But there's like 8,000 works in the Louvre, so I'm your tour guide who's going to try to curate for you a selection of works that I think are important or famous or influential or somehow representative of their age. There are a few big ideas that we're going to keep in mind as we go through this course. One of them is this. What is the use of the world? What do I mean by the world? I mean money, sex, power, and fame. This is what in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance Christian thinkers would have referred to as the world, in the sense that in the Gospels, they say you have to die to the world to be reborn to the Spirit, right? So what is the world? The world is money, sex, power, and fame. And this is what a lot of people write about and for. From Beowulf, a story of heroism and glory, to The Rape of the Lock, an 18th century poem about a woman who loses a card game and throws a temper tantrum after she gets her hair cut off without her consent by a young man who is a friend of hers. So between all these, we have all kinds of stories and poems, and I'm just going to give you a taste of everything we're going to cover and the language that we're going to use to talk about the different periods of English literature that we'll be studying. So as I said, in this course, we cover a vast period of time, over 1,000 years, with enormous changes in material religious culture. England in 500 is scarcely populated, very poor. There's no central government. It's inhabited by a group of the holdouts of the Roman settlers, some Celtic people, and an invading group of Anglo-Saxons. And there's no cities or really central government or advanced economy to speak of. People live in conditions that we would think of as unimaginably primitive for the most part. And that we go all the way from this period to the 18th century, where England is the center of a global empire with enormous luxury, wealth, banking, insurance companies, everything that makes up what we think of as the modern world. So think of this next little bit here as just a trailer, just an overview to give you a sense, first of all, of the historical changes that we'll be covering, and also of the ways in which we speak about the different periods of English literature that we'll be covering. Now, the books divide between the Middle Ages in Volume A, the 16th century and early 17th century in Volume B, and the Restoration and 18th century in Volume C. But there are other terms that are useful in thinking about the periods and changes over time, because the Middle Ages themselves have a significant amount of diversity in them. We're going to start in the early Middle Ages, also called the Old English period, sometimes called the Anglo-Saxon period, though that term is falling out of favor because the term Anglo-Saxon has some unfortunate racial baggage. This goes from around 500 in the Common Era, that's the academic secular way of saying AD, to 1066 CE, when the Normans invade. This is a period, well, we'll talk more about it, but this is the first period that we're talking about, and this is the period when Beowulf and Cadman's Hymn are written. Then we go to the High Middle Ages, or the Late Middle Ages, which we could also call the Age of Chivalry. This here is a scene of manuscript from the Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which we'll be reading. This goes from about the 1100s to circa 1450. That C stands for circa, which is a fancy academic Latin way of saying about. You see C 1450, that means 1450-ish. We can also think of a smaller portion of this Middle Ages, this later Middle Ages period as being particularly important for literature is the later 14th century, a period of what's called Ricardian poetry, or the Age of Chaucer, from around 1380 to 1420. This is the period when Chaucer and a number of his contemporaries turn Middle English, which was the language as we then, into a sophisticated literary language. This image is a selection of the manuscript that one of the manuscripts that Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which we'll be reading part of, was written in. This is still before the invention of the printing press. At this point in history, all literature is handwritten and transmitted through memory and through handwriting. That will change. In 1483, printing will be introduced to England by a guy named William Caxton. This here is a printed book that belonged to this guy. You might know him as Henry VIII when he was still a young man and a prince. The text itself is Cicero's De Officiis, which is De Officiis on duties, and it's basically a book on government and how to be an ethical statesman, which I don't know if Henry VIII got all of that, but this is the period from 1500 to 1550 that's sometimes called the Renaissance. We can also call it the Tudor Age, based on the dynasty to which Henry VIII belonged to. This is one of the most famous poets from that period, Thomas Wyatt, the man who introduced the sonnet from Italian into English. During that time, we also had a very important historical event, or series of events, called the Reformation. Whereas there had previously been one church in Western Europe, which we might identify as the Roman Catholic Church, though medieval Catholicism is not the same as modern Catholicism. A group of Christians, especially in Northern Europe, broke away from the Catholic Church. This pictured here is Martin Luther and John Calvin, who both emphasized the authority of the Bible above the teachings or the authority of the clerical establishment of the Roman Catholic Church. This pictured here is the Tyndale Bible, one of the first English translations of the Bible, and it was printed. And even though it was illegal to print Bibles in English at this point before the English Reformation, it still, once something got into print and you could make thousands and thousands of copies, it was kind of hard to throw the gate closed on that barn after the horse had bolted. Unlike in the Middle Ages, where it was, a little easier to suppress religious dissent when the ideas communicated could only be communicated through written manuscripts. Now, eventually, for reasons we'll discuss later, this guy here decided, even though he was against the Reformation at first, he decided he was actually for it, and England became a Reformed Christian country, and it went back and forth for a while, until Elizabeth firmly established it as a Protestant country, and during her period is sometimes thought of as a golden age of literature, the Elizabethan era, the Renaissance, the early modern period. This is Spenser here, one of the great poets of the age. This is an imprint from Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, which we'll be reading. Here, Elizabeth herself is pictured, the daughter of Henry VIII, who came to the throne in a very surprising and circuitous way, but ruled for a very long time, and was just generally considered a good monarch, and a lot of good poetry happened during her reign. After she died in 1603, her cousin James came to the throne, and William Shakespeare was still writing his plays. Pictured here is Henry Wriothesley, who was Shakespeare's early patron and possibly lover. Pictured here is John Donne, one of the great lyric poets of the period. This period is very famous for poetry. There was an enormous outflowing of it. That poetry, that vogue, that craze for poetry continued into the 17th century. We're now still in Volume B of the Norton. This is Ben Jonson here, who inspired a whole group of followers. He had kind of an entourage who were called the Sons of Ben, or sometimes the Cavalier Poets. This is Catherine Phillips, who's also one of these monarchist poets. And pictured here is Oliver Cromwell, the man who had the king's head cut off and became a theocratic dictator of England for over a decade. But then he died, and there was a restoration, and the king came back, and we had a scientific revolution. And meanwhile, John Milton, who had been part of the Puritan theocratic government, is blind and under house arrest and decides to write an epic poem about the creation of the world and the fall of man called Paradise Lost. We'll be spending a couple weeks on that. This is when the Whigs get really, really big. One of the reasons the Whigs get big in the 17th century is because of an outbreak of a disease imported from the New World called syphilis. And syphilis was treated with mercury, and mercury made your hair fall out. So a lot of very prominent people were wearing wigs. And if the king is wearing wigs and the dukes are wearing wigs, well, I guess I'll wear a wig too. Doesn't that look fashionable? Pictured here, Margaret Cavendish, also on the front of your thesis, one of the great women writers of the age. And yeah, we'll talk more about her later. Finally, we get to the 18th century, also, which referred to itself in a bit of good marketing as the Enlightenment. We also call it as the Augustan age for reasons we'll discuss later in the semester, the Age of Reason, the Age of Swift and Pope. Here's Jonathan Swift pictured here, one of the great satirical writers of the age. I don't know who this person is, but she has pretty fantastic hair, and that is also part of the 18th century. So this has been your movie trailer, your overview of all of the ages that we'll be studying. And cycling back through, it's quite a bit, isn't it? There's a lot of material and cultural change from the early Middle Ages all the way down to the 18th century. But we're going to stay afloat, and we're going to enjoy, and I'm going to ask you to block out time each week for reading, because that's the most important thing in this class, is to keep up with the reading. Thank you for listening, and in our next video, we're going to talk about the Old English period, and historical context, and Caedmon's Hymn, the first recorded known poem in the English language. Talk to you soon.